The Enzo's roaring, naturally aspirated 6-litre V12 creates an inimitable presence, which just a handful of lucky individuals will ever be able to call their own. Production numbers were extremely limited, so when news struck in 2006 of an Enzo getting totaled in a joyride scratching 200 miles an hour, it made big news across the world. The events of the crash, however, were what cemented this story as one of the most memorable car crashes in history. This story takes us to Malibu, early 2006. What remains of a red Ferrari Enzo lay strewn across the Pacific Coast Highway. For hundreds of feet, tiny pieces of priceless Italian supercar littered the scene. The driver had lost control of the 660 horsepower Italian marvel after coming into a large unseen dip in the road. The Enzo got some considerable airtime before flying into a large pole and shattering completely in half. The impact was so severe that the pole came out of the ground and got wedged back in upside down, as if it were an axe being thrown. The scene is extraordinary. A single car creating this much havoc without any other vehicles involved is downright impressive. What's more impressive though is that the driver survived relatively unharmed despite being handed a death sentence by the laws of physics. To the amazement of authorities, he was standing next to the car with another man minding their own business when they arrived at the scene. No, genuinely, his only injury of any note was a busted lip. I guess God must have had other plans in mind for this guy. The other man at the scene was an American by the name of Trevor Carney. He claimed he was sat in the passenger seat of a Mercedes SLR McLaren, which had been racing the Enzo. Strangely, the SLR was nowhere to be found. Naturally, this crash made headlines. It's not every day a $1 million supercar gets totaled in such a dramatic way with no fatalities to speak of. Police worked day and night to pick up the carbon fibre shreds dispersed for seemingly miles down the road, collecting the dust and dumping it all on a flatbed truck. It wouldn't take a genius to take a look at what remains and assume that this Enzo was headed for the scrap heap. The man with the split lip told his side of the story to authorities. He claimed a German, known only as Dietrich, was the one behind the wheel, so the fact that he had failed a breathalyzer wasn't an issue, since of course he wasn't driving. That story almost immediately was found to be a complete fabrication. The moderately drunk man was the driver after all. DNA tests had caught him red-handed, since they found blood on the driver's airbag which matched his. They concluded he was driving, and Trevor Carney, who said he was in a different car, was actually the passenger. The man whose DNA was on the airbag was a Swede by the name of Stefan Eriksson. This is Stefan Eriksson, the man who claims he was not driving the Enzo despite it being his car. He's a Swedish video game developer with an extensive criminal record. He was involved in Gizmondo, a British gaming company, which he worked on with his business associate Carl Freer. Stefan had a pretty lengthy criminal history back home in Sweden. Known as Fat Steve, he did his first stretch in prison after robbing a bank van at just 19 years old. After he was released, the guy became an absolute unit through becoming adept at martial arts and also allegedly some pretty heavy steroid use. Stefan eventually ended up heading a gang, and he didn't try to hide it. The guy was driving around in a Corvette, top to toe in expensive clothes and jewelry, which he funded through selling illicit substances. Again, in 1988, the law caught up to him again, and he served over a year in prison. This second sentence did little to deter him from crime though. Before long, Stefan and his colleagues upped the ante, offering a number of services ranging from kidnappings to fraud. Above all though, the gang's real passion was debt collection. They were known to terrorize debtors and threaten them in ways an above-board collection company simply couldn't. Men indebted to the gang have been known to be severely beaten and threatened at gunpoint. Many of the victims were simply too scared to speak out against the gang for fear of their lives. About 5 years later, all of their fun and games caught up to them again. This time, he was convicted on charges from their attempts to defraud a bank's transfer system, planning to distribute millions in counterfeit money. During a sting operation, gang members got caught attempting to pull out around $3.5 million from other people's accounts. Stefan was convicted of gross fraud and assault, along with a number of other pretty serious crimes. He was sentenced to 10 years, but got out after just 6. Immediately after getting out of prison, he landed a lucrative role at a tech company thanks to Carl, his close associate. Thanks to some weird financial manipulation, they managed to turn a random home furnishings company into an electronics company of the name Tiger Telematics. Originally, Tiger planned to sell GPS devices which would act as a child tracking system. Although the reception was warm from investors, it quickly became apparent that getting a kid to carry around a GPS device at all times wouldn't work. Instead, they announced that they would install the tracker into a handheld games console. Gizmondo developed the handheld gaming console, which was released in the US, UK and Sweden starting in March 2005. The company talked of big expectations of selling 500,000 units in mere months. The company fell apart in the same calendar year though, after bleeding close to $400 million over the span of 4 years. The Gizmondo flopped hard. It had very little marketing and far too high of a price, so very few consumers were willing to touch the thing. The Gizmondo launched at a price of $400 or $229 with smart ads. Smart ads was basically just display advertising built into the device, and it was quite innovative at the time really. Just 8 of the 14 launch titles came to the US, which put customers off even more. What made it worse was it wasn't widely available from your usual shops like Game and GameStop. You needed to buy it either online or from a mall kiosk. With just 25,000 units sold, the Gizmondo was given the coveted title of the worst selling handheld console of all time. It did have FIFA 2005 though, and also a game called Sticky Balls on it, so it's not all bad. Anyway, the Gizmondo was a huge flop, so the fact Stefan imported not 1 but 2 Ferrari Enzos into the US from the UK and then parked them outside a huge mansion might seem a little off, given his presumably poor finances post-business failure, and you'd be absolutely right. Whilst Gizmondo itself had been losing millions, the higher-ups in the company had been enriching themselves from investor funds. They were caught paying for services offered by companies they had ties to, with the most notable being a payment of around $4 million to a game development company owned by Carl's friend. Another time, they paid $3.5 million to a software company that Freer and Ericsson owned nearly half of. It's safe to say that despite the company's failure, Stefan and Carl had managed to walk away with a fair bit of cash before the ship fully sank. The sheriff's office investigating the case received a phone call a few days after the crash hit the news. It was from some officials at Scotland's capital bank. They told the sheriffs that the wrecked Enzo wasn't actually Stefan's, it was theirs. He leased the car in 2005 whilst he was working for Gizmondo Europe. Within a few months of the car being delivered to Stefan, he stopped making payments on the car. When asked why they hadn't reported the car as stolen, they said they thought the Enzo was still in the UK. Later on, another bank rung up. This time it was Lombard. They wanted to know if Stefan had also imported a second Enzo to California. He had indeed. The second Enzo, this one black, was parked on his driveway next to a Mercedes SLR McLaren, which was owned by a third bank. That's right, the guy managed to take millions of dollars worth of assets he didn't own and simply whisk them off to another country without anyone realizing. Bear in mind this was in post 9/11 America as well. Absolutely baffling. On March the 29th, 2006, Stefan's fiancée was pulled over in a Merc SLR McLaren. She didn't have a valid driver's license, the car was unregistered, and it had also been illegally exported. Upon further investigation, it turns out on top of the 2 Enzos and the SLR, Stefan had also exported 2 more Mercs. All 5 of these vehicles were leases with seriously big unpaid balances on them. The case got weirder and weirder from here. We need to talk about the bus police. Shortly after the crash, when sheriffs arrived, Stefan held out a business card to show the sheriffs his identity. The card listed him as being a deputy police commissioner with the San Gabriel Valley Transit Authority. Somehow, Stefan was employed as part of an anti-terrorism unit. It turns out he landed the job by offering to fit CCTV for a bus company. He offered to take out this work in exchange for the honorary title of Deputy Commissioner of the bus company's police department. Confusing, I know. It was basically a legal loophole that the bus company performed. There's a rule in California which supposedly enabled bus companies to form their own private police departments, in the same way that a college might. Stefan claimed the police force he had joined were battling terrorists by operating undercover. The SGVTA website states they were, quote, playing a vital role in the defense of Southern California's homeland security. This didn't really add up to the investigators, unsurprisingly. Why would a bus company make such an unusual arrangement, and in what way would it benefit them? Surely having an entire unit on payroll would make little financial sense for such a minor, non-critical business like a random bus company, right? After a bit of digging, the investigators paired up the bus police, Stefan Eriksson, and a man by the name of Carl Freer. Remember him from earlier? They realised there was a good chance that Freer had used his bus police badge as a means to acquire weaponry more easily by avoiding the headaches associated with having to deal with thorough background checks, which were in place to stop the wrong people from gaining access to an arsenal of deadly firearms. With the pungent smell of suspicion in the air, authorities turned up at Carl's yacht and also his mansion. Searching through both led them to discover 16 guns on his property. It was all starting to look bad for our cunning duo. On April the 8th, 2006, LA sheriffs finally arrested Stefan. They'd been tipped off to the fact he'd got himself a ticket to the UK with no return. Whilst rooting through his Bel Air mansion, they found a .357 Magnum revolver. Strangely, the gun wasn't his, just like the cars weren't. It belonged to a man by the name of Roger Davis, who was connected with politicians and also Carl and Stefan. Davis was a president of Zero Mobile, a completely different company Carl had started since moving over to the US. Davis tries to clear his name, saying that Eriksson isn't anything to do with Zero Mobile, nor is Carl anymore. Shortly after Stefan's arrest, Freer got grabbed too. He was held on suspicion of impersonating a police officer, which he had done in an attempt to get a .44 Magnum. They gave Carl a real grilling and interrogated him for a good while, but he was actually let go. Strangely, the innocent Carl did decide to list his Bel Air mansion for sale soon afterwards though. Stefan, on the other hand, wasn't quite so lucky. Since the courts had determined his assets had been bought from the product of fraud, all his shit got frozen. It wasn't looking good. He faced a multitude of charges and had a $3 million bail set. To put that into perspective, most murderers get a bail set of about $1 million. Meanwhile, questions back in the UK started getting asked around the circumstances leading up to the complete annihilation of Gizmondo. Mammoth amounts of money written off as a loss before the two had resigned were unaccounted for, and no one knew where the money had gone. Investigators dug deep into the complex accounts and discovered a whole web of fraud, intentionally confusing transactions, and unusual activities. At this point, Stefan realised he was well and truly fucked. It sort of reminds me of Uncut Gems, where just the tiniest gust of wind causes his big house of cards to tumble down. This story has so many elements to it, and it gets really confusing and difficult to follow, so I apologise if there are a load of unanswered questions after all this. This section is where I try to tie up as many loose ends as possible in rapid succession in an attempt to cover anything that might be unclear. After the house raid and subsequent arrest, Stefan had a load of charges to deal with. He was arrested on suspicion of embezzlement, grand theft auto, drunken driving, possession of illicit substances, and weapon charges relating to the Magnum which had been found. He initially faced 14 years in prison, which was later reduced in a plea bargain. Then, in May, the charge of a misdemeanor hit and run was added, as well as driving without a California license and registration. Allegedly, Stefan rear-ended someone near his home earlier that year. On May the 9th, the SGVTA, or Bus Police HQ, was raided. The owner was arrested, and a load of weapons, badges, and a makeshift police car were all confiscated. Eventually, Stefan accepted a plea bargain for 3 years in jail and deportation. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of embezzlement and 1 count of illegal gun possession, but avoiding the car-related bits and bobs. He was a free man on January the 21st, 2008. After being deported back to Sweden, he almost immediately got hit with another 18 months for extortion and aggravated assault. Then, in late 2014, he was up against more charges yet again, this time for possession of coke and other illicit substances, as well as driving whilst impaired. There's one final fact I want to raise on Stefan before moving on from him. He raced a Gizmondo-sponsored Ferrari 360 in 2005, where he and his co-drivers completed 218 laps. Now, onto the Enzo. The last time we saw the thing, it was in complete shreds and entirely irreparable, right? Well, somehow the car got listed up on auction. No, not for spare parts or some kind of weird art piece, but as a like-new car. I mean, look at it. Stunning. The Enzo was repaired and overhauled at the Ferrari Technical Assistance Service and is now fully ticked off by Ferrari Classiche, the subdivision which specialises in restorations of Ferraris. This time it's black and also has a few nice upgrades including power windows. It sold for $1.7 million at a Sotheby's auction in Paris. And there you have it. That's possibly my favourite car crash story yet. We've got a near-priceless supercar getting wrecked at an unbelievable speed, a Swedish gangster, fraud, substances, weapons, and just about all the other ingredients you would need to make a great blockbuster film. My hope is that the story of the stolen Enzo crash is eventually immortalised as a movie, but we'll have to wait and see. And with that, thank you so much for watching. I know this is a long one with a bunch of really weird parts that can be hard to follow, but I hope you've had as much fun watching this as I've had making it. Videos like this take ages to research and edit, so I'd really appreciate it if you did subscribe to get notified of more videos just like this coming your way. Finally, I got a few questions in the last video asking for song names. All of the songs in my videos are produced by me and aren't currently released. If you make videos and are fed up of using the same old generic songs, then you should definitely check out Simitone Audio, a company me and a couple of my friends run. We've got all kinds of resources to help you get started in making your own music, which is perfect for YouTube videos, and will make sure you don't get your videos falsely claimed ever again. There's a link in the description if you're interested.